at this point, I think I'm the only one speaking and I don't mind. So please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry for this.
Please don't worry. So, all right. So what I have said so far, hugely summarized, is that to be academics is an important endeavor. We get to pursue our thoughts and ideas. Scientism and disciplinarity are inventions of modernity. There's nothing invalid about combining affective and analytical approaches, so that you look at experience as well as causal mechanisms. That the institutionalization of knowledge production, of which we are a part, confronts us with questions of power and of ethics. Inspirations are important. Acknowledge previous work and embed your work within that. Make visibility for those who might not otherwise be seen. This is hugely important. Okay, moving on. So be open to the possibility of discovering new research puzzles, even in contexts that you think you might be familiar with. It's always worth looking at something from a stranger's eye and to unlearn or look at the familiar. A lot of theorizing is about making the familiar strange, although we often only think about it as making the strange into the familiar, that there's something that exists to us and that doesn't make sense, and here's the theory or the work that makes sense of it. Yes, that's valid, but it's also interesting, and I think quite valuable, to make the familiar into the strange, because the familiar and those sorts of questions that we think are common sense, the answers to which are common sense, they're given, are the ones that we have been conditioned to think of as already answered. But some really interesting questions arise when we re-ask that which we think we know the answer to. So that's really, I think, important. And that leads also to finding various kinds of paradoxes. So to give a practical example, the idea that neoliberalism and nationalism are opposed forces. Neoliberalism is an economic force, markets, works a certain way. Nationalism is a force that exists to create identity. The other one has to do with the economy. These are two different. So in my, in one strand of my work, it's important for me to analyze this paradox of what I call the post-colonial neoliberal nationalism, how that works as a governmentality, that these are actually not opposed forces. And by looking at them as opposed, we grant the autonomous separate domains to what is seen as culture, what is seen as political, and what is seen as culture and what is seen as the domain of the economy. And that split between the culture and the economy then enables further other binaries to function, such as between progressive and regressive, between the national and the international, and so on. So the paper is called the Political Project of Post-Colonial Neoliberal Nationalism. So my illustration here is to emphasize that the familiar can be made into the strange, and that is equally valuable. Next, I think it's vital to share research outside academic communities. So now more and more, I think organizations and institutions and universities and funding bodies recognize, they give it various names, dissemination, impact, or whatever. But the idea is that it is important to have that interaction outside of academia as well, because it requires a switching of mode. And in explaining the same things to different audiences that may not already agree with the coded vocabulary that we know, we also learn better ways of articulating. So there's also kind of an intrinsic and strategic value in doing that, in making those sorts of bridges. It leads us to reflect on the languages that we use and the awareness of why what we do matters. The next point, don't just network, belong to networks. I think that there's good and bad ways of networking. In the times that I started out in my academic career, you were just basically thought of as, we all thought of networking as like this dirty word. That you did networking if you were a mean sort of a person who was instrumentalist and careerist and wanted to use other people. That's not all it is or needs to be. Networks can be seen as ways of finding, discovering connections that can create more meaning and understanding and value to aside from the connection between the individuals, overall in the context, because we might learn something across that. So I think that these, and again, in the context of the institutionalized aspect of knowledge creation that I mentioned earlier, networks are important. But not just networks that one is kind of instrumentally a part of, but I think networks that generate affective solidarities, because they are a good fallback. Academia can be like any other domain, it can be a difficult domain to navigate. And having those sorts of affective solidarities as networks can be a useful, restorative, inspiring, can serve that function as well. And that's important. So belong to networks, don't just network. Next, I think it's important not to fall into the binary of theory versus practice, which is not to say that there aren't different kinds of research that are more or less theoretical or empirical, quantitative or qualitative. There isn't and shouldn't be a hierarchy of how they are ranked. It is possible to ask meaningful questions using different kinds of tools, and running regressions isn't the only way to do it. It's, survey data has its own purpose. In qualitative work of other kinds has its own purpose, and theoretical work has its own purpose. Like these are complementary and not hierarchically, should not be hierarchically ranked modes of thinking. It is in fact vital to see how these two ways of approaching explanation and how these different approaches lead to explanation and understanding. That, while we often use these terms interchangeably, that, explanation and understanding are the same thing, but they're not really. If we look at it from a philosophical point of view, then understanding also has that, has a component which is about putting oneself in the other person's shoes, right? There's this idea of understanding as doing something more than just comprehending something in a mechanical way. And likewise, explanations are actually not, there are different ways of arriving at explanations. As the deductive way of that goes off in search of generalizations and then moves to explaining the particulars through those generalizations. And then the inductive way that starts from observations and seeks to build up a generalization based on the particular observations, and other inductive statistical ways too. But the generation of explanation is actually not is an important part of theorizing, but it's not always obvious what we do when we explain. And by that, I mean, for instance, also, I would like you to reflect upon the thought of why is it that so much social science ends up justifying what it seeks to explain. So a lot of social science takes up a puzzle and it says, okay, here's this puzzle, I'm going to explain it. And then what they do through what they call explanation and often conflate with theorization is at the end to arrive at a point where they can say, well, see, based upon everything that I have told you right now, things could simply not have been any other way. Therefore, what happened is the only possible thing that could have happened. That and that ends up rationalizing social outcomes. And that is actually an extra normative kind of wedge that comes into that story. It's almost imported into that. It's a Trojan horse that's imported into that whole story of what the theorist has done, without actually anyone having remarked on that. So, for example, if we take the example of neoclassical economics, which is obviously the easiest one here, because neoclassical microeconomists especially do this a lot. But if we take the example of, okay, how do we explain gender division of labor? How do we explain discrimination in the marketplace? They end up with assumptions that they start from. So you start from certain kinds of assumption, you make certain kinds of attributions to different kinds of identities, and then you say, okay, this being the case, the rational thing in order to maximize the overall welfare or overall utility, using words carefully, would have been to do what has actually happened. So, the paradigmatic example and the easy target, I would add, in this case would be the work of someone like Gary Becker, the Chicago economist. And in fact, I mean, all Chicago School of Economics, especially as it was through much of the 20th century. But this idea that anything can be explained as the outcome of rational individuals doing what they are doing with certain kinds of assumptions, and that's problematic, because the theorist hasn't just only explained something, they've actually used a whole theoretical schema and various assumptions in order to justify something as being rational. Whereas if one stood outside of that framework, if one stepped outside of that framework for a moment and said, well, actually, what is the word rational doing in this case? The what precise meaning? What does it mean when you say, okay, rational people would do this, and therefore this is the rational outcome? So those sorts of, I think, normative judgments, and um, whether made more or less in a more or less aware and mindful way, are an important part of how social science is functioning. And I think our job as critical scholars is also to call that out, just as it is also to call out other kinds of things that pass for universals when they are actually really particular. So if somebody writes, if there's a paper that's looking at a specific context, it shouldn't, nobody is going to expect that a paper on a country in the global south has a generalized title and abstract that pretends that it's about explaining the whole world. But just look at the number of papers that exist in political science, for example, that actually, from their titles and from all of that paper, it's only speaking. So let's look at political party system, okay, affiliations, political party system, the trajectories of political parties over time, like how that people subscribe less to formal political parties, and all of that work is actually only talking about the US, and at a stretch maybe some European countries. But you would never know that from the titles of all of those papers, from all of those titles of all of those books, or even the abstracts and the actual articles themselves. So that's a problem, and that needs to be called out constantly, even if that means that we are the grit in the machine that says, okay, but that's actually not universal. I think that needs to continue being said, that that's not universal. What you're doing is talking about this particular country. And if you were talking about some other particular country where political party affiliations over time have had shown a completely different trajectory and have actually not decreased, but really increased, and I can think of one example immediately where political party membership has gone up, then it's simply not doing that job while it's claiming to be universal. So that's, I think, again, an important part. And there isn't a good way of immunizing ourselves. The best, all of us are prone to mistakes, are prone to making errors of judgment, are prone to our prejudices, which we hold really dear and hate to be challenged on. And the only thing, I guess, is a kind of constant Bayesian updating, that you allow yourself that space to say, okay, today I think this, but then don't judge yourself too harshly for changing your mind further, if you have taken in new evidence or things that you hadn't encountered before. That's really, I think that's part of that journey. Next, methodology is really important, regardless of what approach one takes to one's work. It's important because it requires us to reflect on the basic questions of method. It's like an X-ray or of our toolkit. But it's also worth bearing in mind how methodologies change over time. So again, looking back at this simplistic idea that people had in 20th century of Popperian, Karl Popper, the philosopher, Popperian falsificationism, that good theories survive falsifications, theories that don't survive falsifications fall by the wayside, and better theories take their place. To something like the Kuhnian paradigm shift idea, right? That there's the old guard, and as long as the old guard is there, things don't change. But then there are the new people who come in, and over time things change. And that's just an organic evolution sort of process. It just happens. Where you see this as a stylized, I think the clever thing about the Kuhnian paradigm is that it's very intuitive, it's persuasive, but I think it makes that into an automatic sort of stylized process that happens between different, with generationally, rather than thinking about what specific paradigms continue to stay entrenched and don't actually shift. That it doesn't give any kind of specific power and identity focus to how, when, and which paradigms do and don't change. Even though the idea, of course, in a very, very generic way that, yeah, paradigms change makes sense. And that actually, there's historical work that came out at the turn of the century, at the end of the start of the 21st century, that looks at Kuhn's own involvement within Cold War agendas that partly shaped his thinking. But So yeah, so it's always worth bearing in mind. The other thing I think is the way in which, again, linked back to the Popperian falsification kinds of issues, this idea that with new evidence, theories, automatically get challenged, but they don't. So people are very good at cognitive dissonance management. If we go back, I mean, the whole, the idea of cognitive dissonance from Festinger's work back in the 50s, and it's used in so much in marketing, which I'm sure many of you are totally into, like this understanding of not marketing per se, but this understanding of how it works, that people are really good at holding contradictory sorts of beliefs. One interesting example of that I was recently that I recently came across when working on the AI paper, is this question of, not only do people hold contradictory beliefs and continue to find ways of justifying that they're actually holding these contradictory beliefs, but they also will not, so for instance, they will not support certain political outcomes. But when those political outcomes, those very same political outcomes, are presented to them as outcomes that result from the adoption of certain kinds of technologies, in other words, via a technocratic route, then they will accept the same political outcomes that they would not accept in political terms if it were presented to them. But the fact that they accept certain kinds of technological change and technical arrangements for organizing space or society, which actually result in those very same political outcomes that they would have not agreed with, they actually end up agreeing with. So, the relationship, in other words, between evidence, factuality, and how that leads to change is very non-linear. It's not that there are facts and facts make people think differently and change their mind. The human animal is a lot more complex than that. And finally, I mean, again, the idea of that, the kind of pyramid sort of idea that, that it's not, we should not be worried that if we lose a certain gold standard of truth or objectivity, then we're just all going to be lapsed into a world where we can't make moral judgments at all. It's simply not true. We always make specific moral judgments from the positions where we are based, from our own specific standpoints. And that's really crucial. One thing that isn't written down here, but that has just occurred to me, is also, I think it's quite useful when looking for theoretical puzzles or ways to move one's thought forward, is to think of how certain historical episodes or things get ascribed to certain disciplines but not others. So if we think about, for instance, how, and here my impetus for thinking this is, if you think about how from early 20th century to pretty much 60s, the idea of racial, the powerful ways in which racial difference was emphasized, all of that gets to be seen as part of sociology and anthropology, but not as part of international relations. It's only now being recovered in international relations, where scholars are saying, actually, the history of the international systems are also a history of race and racializations. So there are also ways in which historically certain kinds of knowledges get bracketed along certain, in certain ways that serve a purpose, that serve certain interests and make power function a certain way. And race and IR was the example I was thinking there. Okay, then do reflect on the reason, the raison d'etre of your work. Why are you doing what you're doing? Again, very simple, very obvious question. It's like your grandfather or your mom or someone or your best friend telling you, you must drink a lot of water and you must eat on time. We all know that that's true. But gosh, I mean, not drinking water, not eating on time in life has caused me so many health problems that, sometimes we just forget that we're just not thinking of the most obvious things most of the time. So it's a bit like that. You have to reflect on why you're doing what you're doing, but you don't always do that, just like you don't always drink enough water. So theory always serves a purpose. Every question that you're asking is a question that you're asking for a certain reason, and that reason should be something that you keep in mind. When I was growing up, I don't know if it's still the case, you could tell me, but our textbooks used to have the Gandhian talisman at the start. Do they still have it? Do they still allow Gandhian textbooks? Okay, right. You know, this idea of how is it that when you're trying to think of, does it make a difference? Try and think of, you know, the worst possible situation in person that you can. Will it make any difference? Most likely, for most of what we do, it often doesn't. But it doesn't hurt to. It's useful, I think, and it doesn't kind of hinder us to always keep in mind all the various dispossessions that are enabled by by delegitimizing certain identities and by delegitimizing and by legitimizing certain narratives that allow for ever greater, creation of ever greater inequality um, or bigotry or whatever. It's always useful, I think, both within countries and across countries, and that's really important. I think the really important part of thinking along lines that are feminist and post-colonial and decolonial and ecologically sane, etc., is not simply that we all only, we start our article with citing Kihano and then we say, okay, Kihano, and then Ranajit Guha and Brilliant and Spivak, and and here we are, we've done something decolonial. Of course, by all means cite them. But my point is that moving beyond simply just taking as given, pulling off the shelf what decolonial or feminist or post-colonial means, I think these are also and should be our own questions in critical knowledge making. Like, how do we make better knowledge? Because that is important. All knowledges are situated, and knowledges in the global north are benefit from a sanctioned ignorance, to use Spivak's term here, that the not knowing of the not knowing of many things doesn't impose a cost. I mean, so patriarchal systems are a very good example of that. Men don't lose very much by not knowing so many struggles that women undergo globally. And that's sanctioned ignorance. The system in effect sanctions it for you, and something similar happens in the global context. So it is important to challenge that, and to question, who do you work for? What are you unable to say and why? Could you frame what you are saying in less exclusive and more inclusionary ways, and therefore find more readers who might be more persuaded with what you're doing? Ideally, theoretical work has its place. And I would say, don't let people tell you that if you're doing only theory, you're not doing the world, or if you're doing only world, you're not doing the theory. These two things, theory and practice, are interrelated. Ideas move the world, and the world is moved by ideas. So that's very kind of symbiotic and syncretic a relationship. You've probably, many of you, I can't remember, but maybe you've completed your PhDs, maybe you're in the process of writing your dissertations. So if you are in the process of working on a very kind of focused piece of work, also, and some days it feels like it takes over your life, and that's like everything is just that, comes to just that. But looking back, I can guarantee that looking back in retrospect, you will relish the fact that you were in a place where you could focus and spend so much time focusing on that particular thing. Because as you move along, it just gets more and more diffuse, and you really think, if only I could have that 1 year even, or 6 months even, to just really sit down and focus and only work on this one thing, to create this only one dissertation or book or monograph. That just becomes very much harder, and you have to go through endless hoops of trying to get funding, trying to fill any number of applications just to get that thing that you do when you're actually writing a master's dissertation or a PhD thesis. So yeah, and I think the other thing for those of you, those among you who want to change the world in big or small ways, be patient. The world doesn't get changed easily. We live and live out our lives. It's the labor of years. And even then things maybe don't change, but even if they do not, if we didn't, it would change us. I cannot attribute this because I can't remember who it's from, but I remember this from my college days. This idea is the point of changing the world is that if you stop, whether you succeed or not, if you stop, it's going to change you. And so, in ways that are not good. So you have to carry on and try to, I would say, also not be too cynical. Things are not, cynicism has its place, but I find that a lot of academics end up being, not to kind of, insinuate anything specific against any specific colleagues, but I think a lot of academics over time just end up being very cynical as part of that process, and you just think, oh well, I'm just doing this thing, and jaded and all of that. So try and avoid that. It's almost as bad as hubris, because you also have then the people who just think that, oh my God, they're at this place that they're absolutely untouchable, and they're, mini idols. And finally, I think, practice self-care. I recently had a message just this morning, actually, from a scholar who was referring to this. So your take care of also of your, as you work, as you write the articles, as you create these networks, please also take very good care of your hands and your eyes and your back. But the hands and eyes are really important, and especially the hands. I had repetitive strain injury. I think I was one of the first people to be afflicted with it, or in the late 90s, and it's been the bane of my life, because I have to use voice software. I simply cannot, because I just, it's just hard. So take care of the things that you work with, which is your head, your eyes, and your hands. Which again, I think also brings us to this question of your own embodiment. That as scholars, as people who deal with ideas and in that domain, we often tend to forget, and it's actually a legacy of larger systems of knowledge that deal and trade within the idea of the abstract individuals that are all interchangeable and simply happen to inhabit different historical times or different geographical countries, and that's all that's different about them. They're just people, but they're not people. They're specific people. They have people who have bodies who that that feel and laugh and pain and suffer in specific ways. And I think we also forget about that as scholars, that we're thinking of what we're of our minds much more than we're thinking of taking care of our bodies and our health. So that's really important as well. I think that is maybe the last thing. Do not. We're storytellers. I think I just want to end up on that. I think I want to just end with saying we're all storytellers, and we have to, So part of when somebody says, when a reviewer sends you back a paper and says something mean, or if it's an absolutely mean thing, there's not very much you can do about it. If the reviewer is moved by a personal animus or a funding application response or something, but if somebody sends you back something that seems to totally not understand your ideas, try to be as zen about it as possible. Never take personally, even though it's really hard. Maybe put it on a piece of paper and stick it in front of your work desk. Never take personally these sorts of comments from reviewers, from people who respond in a very ungenerous and overly unnecessarily critical way. Don't take that personally. Also think of people as, if people are responding in that way, maybe they're just insecure, and sometimes they just want the validation of your witnessing of the fact that they have a certain skill or ability or expertise. It doesn't hurt to kind of do that Michelle Obama thing of, not going low when they go low, you go high kind of a thing, and trying to respond in a way that you say, okay, I actually acknowledge that this is what you find really difficult to understand about what I'm arguing. But the reason why this is important is this. So if you look at it in this way, it might make sense. So try and sort of give them as much benefit of doubt as possible, and try to not look at it personally. Give it some time, like with articles and anything else. Just give yourself a bit of space, because we get perspective. Distance is what gives us perspective. Just as it is in geography, it's also the same in our perceptions. When we look back at something with a slightly more distance, we have more of a perspective on it. So in responding to those sorts of comments, I think that distance really helps. And something that I learned really late is this idea of co-authoring. I don't know. I think things simply didn't work out. The ways in which that I had. So I actually came to co-authoring late in my career, but I think it's a if you have good co-authors, then that's certainly something worth pursuing. But also equally, because there are ways in which co-authorship could be exploitative for one or other side, I think more and more there's also this idea of this statement of attribution of authorship, where your article can, especially if you're working with somebody more senior and you worry about the fact that your ideas may not get the due acknowledgement, that the authorship statement actually states that the first draft was prepared by so and so, this person contributed to the reading and the reviewing. So there are ways in which you can, in a systemic sort of a way, guard against having your work being taken advantage of, while at the same time avail of the advantages of co-authoring with someone. The conference papers are obviously a great idea to build any new research kind of direction, and I think that process is really helpful. I think I did say that that was the last thing, so maybe I should stop. And now I want to hear from you. Yeah.
Yeah, please feel free to ask your questions, comments, experiences, whatever you feel to share.
Yeah, if you want to just share any insights, as Muneeb may have already told you, that I would welcome being able to actually specifically answer things that, or even reflect on or hear from specific things that you might have, or. Please don't. Somebody has their hands up. SN has their hands up.
Yes, Sumita, go ahead. Yeah.
I'll go after Andy.
Okay. So I had a question, two questions, which I'm feeling really embarrassed to ask, but I'll ask all the same. So after listening to all the talks, I've just been reflecting on this thing. Like, I'm not very sure how to articulate it, but what does it mean to make a theoretical contribution in a paper? Like, how do we know that we are making it happen in our work?
Right. Okay. And did you have something, before I respond, did you have something specific in mind? Can you sort of say, for instance, when I was thinking about this particular thing or something like that, just so I.
So say, for example, say I'm writing an autoethnographic paper of how I am navigating an educational space as a queer person. Mm-hmm. Now, so in a paper like this, there's nothing really novel that I'm going to say, because while I will be excavating my own personal experiences to say something basically very I'm not really going to say anything earth-shattering, other than the fact that queer people have certain kind of experiences, and this is how, or these are the measures that can be taken to make people like us feel more included. So when it comes to thinking about what kind of a theoretical contribution I'm making in my work, I'm just trying to ask myself, what is something different, or how am I going to frame it differently to say basically something which is very perhaps commonsensical.
Okay. Should I, Muneeb, would you like me to respond to each question, or should I do that, or would you want me to hear the other question and then respond? I'm happy to do either.
Yeah, up to you. We haven't kept any schedule or structure, so we'll figure it out.
Okay. So I will need a few seconds. Okay, I want to let you. I need a few seconds to really think about what I want to say beyond what I think I know what I want to say. I just want to get a sense of, because this question of what theory does is that we think of theory as something that is alchemical, right? It's almost like a philosopher's stone. It kind of converts something into something else. And I think that's not all of it. Now, if you just let me get to a book. Yeah, just 1 second. So in my first book, which was actually called Imagining Economics Otherwise, towards the end, and it's a book that kind of traverses across disciplines, but I think that somewhere towards the end, I talk about how theorization. So not only is there not a straightforward link between, I'm working my way towards your question. So not only is there not a straightforward link between emancipation and epistemology, what I was saying earlier about more truth, more facts, better, whatever, liberation, but also that theorizing, that theory is actually something. So the subsection 7.2.5 is what I'm thinking of, what I thought of, which is called making theory hospitable to travel. Okay, so the idea of so what do we do when we write? Like, what is the writing of theory? What is it composed of? And I'll just read certain bits. That so basically the writing is difficult because the marked privileges, what is the marked privileges, and the unsaid is not the same as the unwritten. The legitimacy of voice, the transfer and translation of value. Now, in this context, I'm talking about something specific, but the travel bit relates to something like Hume cautions us against travelers' tales. So there's a long-standing thing in history that tells us don't take the perspectives of people that aren't already canonized, already known as the experts and whatever. These are just travelers' tales. And the word travelers' tales itself gets used as something that's just things that people who are marginal shouldn't, travelers are people who just pass through. What do they know? Now, my point here is that theory, so I quote work that theory comes from the Greek theorein, which is the practice of travel and observation. So a man who was sent, and in those days, typically a man, was sent by the polis to another city, from one polis to another city to witness a religious ceremony. And therefore, theory is a product of displacement, comparison, and a certain distance. To theorize, my words here, to theorize, one leaves home. So theory is, in a sense, about that displacement, that the leaving, you leave home to theorize. You can't theorize if you're only sitting at home. And that home isn't just obviously a geographical place. The home is the thing. So you move outside of what you know in order to be able to theorize. And the kind of the historical parallel that I was giving there, the scholar that most explicitly kind of has talked about it is Edward Said, who talks about, traveling theory and how theory travels through representation, resistance, and institutionalization. But I think that a space for imagining theoretical endeavors that challenges the practice of theory itself, its ability to be adequate. Theory not as interpreting or explaining, but understanding its own conditions of performance and its particular arrangements of mediation in making and accessing the world. Right. So to come back to this question, therefore, so the idea of what theory is not a kind of a blueprint to somebody who is, because this is such a multiple incorrigible world, to somebody who is writing a straightforward political science paper, again based on something lots of things I've been reading on territorial conflict. Theory might mean something completely different, right? But in certain kinds of meaning making, the idea of theory is a lot more connected to this leaving of home. There's this theory that never leaves home, which is that kind of theory, and there's theory that comes from leaving home. That's the product of displacement, of translating oneself in other contexts. And overall, what I would say is, what I have said. So in terms of proposing a methodological way of thinking about this, I've called it CSPE, contextual social political economy, that you're never actually, so in terms of a methodology, I call that methodology a contextual social political economy, where you don't see the social, political, and economic aspects as being amenable to kind of analysis in separate ways. But the context, it is, you start from the context, and within that you see, within this context, what gets constituted is social, what gets constituted is political, and what comes to be seen as economic. And that's actually it's not a given. The idea of what the economic is, or what gets seen as the political, comes from the delineation of the context, rather than from something that we know already. This is the economic thing or the political thing that we can identify. It's the other way around, actually, I would argue. Now, to come back to this, that the contribution of theory, so it's not, so what you're asking, I think, is neither, or what you're stating is not at all, basic. I think it's a really important question, and I think that's part of the process of theorizing, because your uncertainty as to what theorizing would constitute in this context is also reflective of how how theorizing, what theorizing, the expectations that theorizing comes with, and why they are problematic. Like, what does it mean to theorize? And what it means to theorize is to put that model out, or is to provide that causal mechanism, or is to do that thing. And that does not have a space in its conventional format for the thing that is theory to you, for what leaving home means, or for the displacement and comparison that your experience produces. And so I think that is the kernel of what I would see as the theoretical thing, that you would start from here. Because so the powerful thing about navigating the, what you're talking about, this autoethnographic experience of navigating the spaces of an institution as a queer person, is about excavating your personal spaces. But the extent to which your personal spaces and your experiences, both personal and political, are determined by by the structures of power, is itself political. That, what is seen as your personal private thing, and what are the expressions that are validated or invalidated for an individual, from that, with a queer identity, is part of that theory. So what you're doing there is actually theoretical. And then, of course, there are ways in which, you might make, it is possible to, I think, it is possible to expand that into thinking how experiences of someone who does not have that identity, or who does not ascribe to that identity, how those are systematically different. And that comparison of that systematicness in the difference is again part of the theory. Equally, the way in which that experience in that part of the world, or in that regional context, might be different from a different regional context, and where it is different, what are the, does that difference come at the cost of, it's an odd word to use here, but I think it's actually relevant, come at the cost of a certain kind of commodification of identity? Is it, what are the ways in which the expressions of identity are, um, retain an authenticity that stops short of commodification and of exoticization? And how does that, and what does that tell us if we were to think about these questions in terms of, from a very basic sort of even policy things? One might have things to say that, there's always like, uh, different degrees of difficulty in implementing certain kinds of things, but some of them may not be that difficult, may just be about thinking about unconscious bias, or reflecting upon, certain kinds of, normalized ways of thinking. I don't know if you know the work, you might already, in which case forgive me, of the sociologist Zerubbabel. The book is called Taken for Granted: The Remarkable Power of the Unremarkable. And just the ascription of words that we use, the semiotic weight that is given to construct power differences, all of that is powerful. And I think that's, that there's just, I think there's no dearth of theory at all in there. But I think what the hesitation that I sense from you is maybe more about thinking that theory is a certain thing, and then how do you do that thing here. But I think that experience is part of that theoretical process as well.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor Shrimata this side.
Yes.
If you can hear me, sorry, I'm sitting in a place where the connectivity is very poor. So I have two questions.
Is that okay? Is that how it should be? Is that how it should be? By the way, Muneeb.
No, there's no rule about having a video on.
No, that's not what I'm. So because I can actually only see 2-3 people, and there's a whole lot of other. Is that how it's meant to be?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes, please go on, Shmita.
Yeah. So, Professor, my first question is: you spoke about technology when you were telling about a few pointers, right? So you said that when few things are not really working, so there is a path, for example, taken from the technology point of view. So can you give an example, like what exactly you mean by that? That's my first question. And the second one is, you said the very first thing you said is like, it is valuable to make familiar into more strange, right? But as student, like, we meet a lot of other professors from the institute, from outside the institute, and what we hear is like, try to do something which is new, or maybe again, something, say for example, there's a lot of work going around the gig, right?
Around
So
around
gig workers or gig economy, because that is the I mean, like, that's the economy we see at the moment, right? For example, Uber and other, Upwork and everything. So similarly, we get to hear from professors and a lot of other scholars that something that will catch the interest of, say, publishers, or somebody who would want to read it, or say the new age scholars. So how do you really say that familiar into strange would be a wise idea? I mean, like, I would want to know examples in both the scenarios. Like, my first question itself, I would want you to, give an example, and the second. So I hope my questions are clear.
yes, they are.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shmita. So what I was referring to there with the idea of technology was really not so much specifically about technology, but about the interaction between technology and acceptance of certain kinds of political arrangements. So the relationship, therefore, between technological arrangements and political arrangements, and so I'm thinking back to the work on technologies, on socio-technical knowledges in the 1980s, where people were saying, what are their technologies? So there's two things I want to tell you. One was this contrast that people at the time, scholars at the time, traced between authoritarian techniques and democratic techniques. So technologies that enable more authoritarian forms of social organization and technologies that enable a more democratic form of social organization. Okay, so in this case, there are certain technologies, say if you think about the internet, right? That could, so one could argue that it could enable either of those two, but they are social media sorts of technologies are generally seen as moving towards in a more democratization trend, okay, that they help more certain kinds of democratic politics. Whereas there are certain kinds of technologies, and by technologies, one doesn't even just mean, gadgets. So for instance, think about the adoption of nuclear power. Are you with me?
Yes, Professor.
Yes, okay. So yeah, you can call me Nitasha. So if you think about something like nuclear power, okay, now the adoption on a large scale by a whole lot of nations of the use of nuclear power for electricity generation. That's a choice that a nation or a country makes. So countries that decide to switch to nuclear power or to expend resources on nuclear power. Now nuclear power itself, the question there really that question is, are technologies neutral? Or do technologies contain within them certain political arrangements? Now, if you have a nuclear, kind of, if you adopt nuclear technologies for a society, then that obviously requires, by the nature of that technology, it would require higher degrees of security, greater centralizations of power, less diffusion of information, more careful management that is interested to a narrower set of experts, and so on. So in that case, the adoption of technology itself enables a certain kind of thing that comes with it, that, in order just for that technology to function in the way that it does function. And that, so those questions are essentially these kind of, questions of looking at encouraging policymakers or public policy theorists to think beyond simply that. People often think, when there's a new technology, they think, what are the costs of it? What are the benefits of it? Is it workable? How many people will it benefit, etc. So they think from the terms of that technology. This is the work that I'm referring to. The authors' last names are Sklove and Winner. So they think about, like, is this technology, the practical sorts of questions. What they don't think about very often is the bigger question of what would it mean to adopt this rather than an alternative other kind of technology that would shape social relations in a different way. And because that big picture question is not asked in lots of individual instances of technological adoption scenarios, we go along a path-dependent scenario where what has gone before determines what comes after, and we then get more and more entrenched along the line of a certain kind of social organization. And so to give that practical example, I would have used the example of the nuclear adoption of nuclear technology for electricity, etc. Now, your second question about the familiar and the strange. Now, I have views on the extent to which academia in certain parts of the world tends to be unnecessarily hierarchical, and that reduces mentorship often to apprenticeship, and with with a much greater sort of subjection required on the parts of the students, and it's not. I don't think it's the best way in which we can co-create knowledge. But nonetheless, the reason I'm referring to that is because you said our professors tell us what to, to do this or do that. And I'm just thinking that, yeah, I mean, okay, but
everyone is like our professor, so I can't really say somebody from my institute is my only professor. So
yeah,
like,
no, but what I mean is that, there tends to be this greater vertical centralized situation, hierarchies are more palpable. So whatever, I mean, basically what I'm trying to say is that it's okay to challenge your professor. It's okay for me or you or anyone to do that, because that's how we progress. You don't need to, but if needed, you can. It shouldn't be a crime. Okay, so this. So your professor, when they say, or when academics say that there's this gig economy, it's the thing, it's the fashionable thing to work on, and that's what you should work on. I have no problems with, I would say, yeah, that's fine. That's a person's point of view. But whether, and I think that reflects a choice of whether you want to bandwagon on what the new thing is in fashion and do that because you think there's a greater, reward to it, potential reward to it, or whether you want to actually work on something, and these need not be mutually exclusive, but in case there are, then you have a question to think about, or whether you want to work on something that's actually intellectually more interesting to you and more driving for you, like it's a bigger question to you, it's something that you want to get an answer on, that you feel more passionate about, that maybe it's not fashionable. So now you have a whole range of people saying online how for years they were told, you're crazy to specialize in Russia, it's just so totally not fashionable, nobody's ever going to care about your expertise on Russia. And look at the fact that now with the Ukraine situation, Russian specialists, so anyone who specialized in lots of other parts of the world that were thought of as being the cool thing or the important thing, I mean it's so is not irrelevant. So my North Star here, like the thing that would, the true north of the compass here for me in terms of what drives intellectual inquiry, would be to work on things that you actually find interesting, that move you, that you are passionate about, that you think you have some contribution to make, even if that's maybe not as fashionable. Because I think that that the drive that you have in answering that question would be more useful in the kinds of work that you can produce. Now, it could also be that your professor says work on gig economy and you're really passionate about working on gig economy and it's also fashionable. Great, then you have a sweet spot. Everything, kind of everything's good about that. Then you have no questions. But I'm just pointing to a possibility that when there is a divergence, it's better to be guided by your own passions than by just simply something being in vogue, because fashions are fickle and they change. Now, about the gig economy thing. So, and also the familiar to strange, but let me just focus on the gig economy thing and then I'll come back to the familiar strange. So the gig economy thing, the thing is, so you look at, I don't know what, what work, are you actually working on the gig economy right now?
No, I'm not. I just took an example because
Okay.
I see a lot of people working on it, and I see a lot of collaboration, and it's an interesting phenomena, I would say, and it's still at the very nascent stage.
Yes, and it is an important transformation. It's interesting. It's also driving. So so the stand. I'm guessing the more commonplace of way of looking at this is to look at the ways in which it is maybe changing patterns of work,
Yeah, your
commute,
work. Yeah, exactly.
travel, distribution of income, as regional economies. traffic congestion, things like that. Maybe those are the more, or e-commerce platforms, development of apps. Those might be the sorts of things that I think would be more commonplace with studying something like this. However, so to me, if I, based on my experience whenever I'm there, so to me, there are lots of other really interesting questions that I would want answers to, and if I was in that context, that I would want, what do, and which are not necessarily just big data questions. There's qualitative survey, interviews kind of questions. Is so the numbers, what is the experience, what do we learn if we look at the experience of those who are delivering the Zomato thing daily, doing the Uber thing daily? What do we learn from, if we looked at this instead of from the point of view of the kind of overall economy perspective, if we looked at this from the ground up, like from those individuals themselves, about how they see what the transformation that they are a part of, and whether their perception of the transformation that they are a part of is in any way systematically different from the perception of that transformation from the point of view of those who are driving these changes. So, what do Uber and Zomato executives think about this? It's not a question that we know, a priori. It requires research. And what do the people who work for them? Of course, you'd have to go through ethical procedures, etc., guard confidentiality. But what is the view at the top and the bottom ends of the gig economy, if we look at this as a vertical imaginary, by the way, which is just a reflex thing because of power, but we could also look at this word horizontally. So that would be one thing. The other thing that I would want to ask, I actually do really want to ask, is if we think about the fact that, and this has been my own experience too, so there are apps that overpromise things that are there. They'll say, we'll do this, we'll do that. People in difficult situations, pay money to those apps, ask them to get those things. They don't do that. There's then a lot of frustration at every end. That frustration, then they call the person, the customer services person, at the end of the Zomato person or the Uber person or whoever that you call to for help. And that person then has the thing of listening to a lot of frustrated people they don't have power, by the way. That person doesn't have a lot of power. They're not a huge manager. They're just a customer services person whose only advantage in this scenario is they're not the ones running on the streets delivering the food. But they're having to constantly apologize. We're really, really sorry. We're really sorry. I understand, madam. We're really sorry. I understand, sir. We're really sorry. They're doing that hundreds of times a day. So the question that I would have, in order to understand different aspects of this gig economy, moving beyond the more commonplace ones, is what is the affective labor required on the part of those people who function as mediators, important mediators between those who deliver and those who ask. Okay, so that question would be something that I would love to read a paper where somebody does that. So that would be, and these are not things that these are things that not things that I'm reading off somewhere, but I'm simply thinking in terms of, if we are 24/7, when we are engaging with the world, we're mindful, the questions just present themselves, right? So and there are ways in which we can ask questions that have not been asked before, or not been asked before in the same way. The relationship between the familiar and the strange, I think in that context, I would say, so making the strange into the familiar is the standard thing, that we don't know how this works. This is how this works. I'll tell you. What I was trying to say over there is that you could also, if you take something that this is why A leads to B, and you could also stop yourself and say, oh, well, why does A lead to B? Why is everyone so convinced that A leads to B in this way? What if A led to B through a different way, and we're not actually seeing that different mechanism or pathway? So my question with the familiar and strange was that intellectually, it is also satisfying to ask questions that challenge the ways in which we've already thought, and to re-ask those questions. So my example there was the fact that neoliberalism and nationalism are seen as opposed forces, whereas for me, it was important to step back and say, but are they really opposed? Very often the nation and the economy get used in ways that not only have a metaphorical similarity and a rhetorical similarity in the uses they perform, but also there's actually not, so there's a borrowing of language, etc., but also the dynamics. What gets to be seen as part of the nation and economy, that dynamics, it's not what people think it is at first glance. So that was the familiar and strange point.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I just want to, yeah, thinking on the conversation, if we try to sort of apply the same framework to the gig economy as well, what's so natural about, why do we think gig economy was the natural outcome of certain transformations? Why is it not surprise? For example, we had COVID and we all got surprised, but why did gig economy not surprise us? Why is it so natural for us, or why do we see it as inevitable? So that would also be an example of trying to make this familiar into a strange thing, rather than seeing that, oh, okay, it's explained by technology, or it's explained this and that, and trying to question that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. That, I think the point of our discussion here, I see that as driving towards the fact that we should not accept things as simply being inevitable,
Yeah.
without critically asking questions about them. If something is the case, it is because it is, does not suit an academic frame of mind in that sense. I mean, we have to ask, if it is the way it is, what is it not? What else could it have been? Why is it the way it is here in this way? How does that impact, those who are a part of it, and so on? So what will it do in the longer run, and etc. And so the same thing with the, oh gosh, the Bitcoin madness globally, right? That it's the thing to do, Bitcoins, cryptocurrency, etc. But there was this really brilliant piece. I don't know if anyone's come across it. It's called What's the Line? NFT. It's a brilliant kind of 2 hour, very intense economics and cyber currency, the kind of thing that totally takes down the idea of NFTs as scam. So I would definitely recommend it. It's called Muneeb, maybe you can look this up. Where's the line or something? It's called. It's if you just put the word line and NFT, it's a YouTube video. It's a 2 hour YouTube video made by this kind of person who's obviously very um, well researched and erudite, and they just make these kind of thoughtful video essays. It's called The Line Is Up. Sorry, it's called The Line Is Up. It's a video on NFTs. So he starts from talking about the line is up, and he starts by talking about Dan something. His name is. He starts by talking about the 2007 onwards, the recession and the subprime crisis and the mortgage situation and housing crisis, and then kind of builds up the link between the economic crises in the real economy, as it were, and the move towards digital and the promises of the digital, and how they promise, this kind of thing to workers in Southeast Asia, that you can sit at home the whole day, play games, and you can earn these tokens, and how basically how that works. So yeah, anyway, I don't know how we got there, but we got there. So we should come back. All right.
I think Garima has a question.
Yeah. GK. Sorry. Garima, what's your full name?
Hello, Professor Nitasha. This is Garima here. I am a last year doctoral candidate at IIM Ahmedabad. And
Okay.
just because we were having conversations around gig economy, so as a part of my thesis, I've been studying subjective experiences of food delivery workers related to their facing bullying and how they navigate through it, and its implications on their well. So the dark side of gig economy, basically. So, my coming to my question. So, you mentioned this idea of cynicism that we should stay away from. But what I grapple with as an early career scholar mostly is, and you encouraged, as it is widely, to participate in conferences and share ideas to grow networks and to gain co-authorship. But at this juncture, I often grapple with and have dilemmas regarding sharing, because ultimately, what matters ultimately is whether it's converted into a manuscript or something tangible worth, just like whether it moves from your ideation stage to the actual concrete stage where people are reading it. And then I find that there is a sense of urgency that to get it out, and others might get it's what I have encountered from my experiences, that those who get to collect data on it and talk about it first, so they have an advantage. So though the idea of abundance is there, that there are abundance of ideas, but considering the stage at which you are, where there is considerable more freedom to foray into uncharted territories based on your interest, compared to someone who is just entering and there are other response, I mean, there's a limited time in which you need to publish to get tenure. So I like is this dilemma, and then this is creating cynicism. I mean, I see it as cynicism, and I just resonated with this idea, resonated with me. So so have you encountered it, or what would you suggest to deal with it? I mean, I wanted to know your thoughts on this. Thank you.
So, thank you. A few kind of things that you've raised, that they're sort of within the same broad paragraph, but with significant differences. So the first point about your own work, which sounds really interesting and important. I don't know whether you focus on a city or a company or whatever, but I'm sure that that's the sort of work that people would be interested in looking at. I'm trying to think of a paper that I came across on the experiences of, so there's papers on these sorts, on cab drivers and Uber cab drivers. So there's also potential for expanding in the future beyond looking at one particular sector of the economy to wider, and also whether in countries where there's more or less regulation and more or less ability for workers to ask for some sort of right, whether those things improve the situation or not. So first of all, that sounds like really important work. Secondly, I think what I also saw this concern about what you said was dilemmas regarding sharing. So I'm now trying to think back to a paper that I had when I was a PhD student, and it was an economics and philosophy paper, and when I was discussing supervisor, and she said, and whether I ought to put it out in the public domain, and and whether somebody would just pick up the idea and run with it. And she seemed to be of the opinion, and I was persuaded at the time, that knowledge isn't lessened by sharing, and that as long as authorship is clearly mentioned. So I did, and and that's I think it's a balance between disseminating one's work and just holding it really close to one's chest and not sharing it until it's final. I don't think there's a good answer that another person can give to anyone. I think it really depends on the nature of the work. I think if you're working on something that is state or for anyone that's working on state or security sensitive, etc., or technologically significant or whatever, I think I would say, be careful about what you share with what audience when. But I think broadly speaking, work it doesn't hurt to share work, as long as and nowadays there are so many ways in which you can actually lay authorship claims. So, if your paper is put on academia or some site or some subject specific repository under your name with watermarks or something on it on every page, and if you like, you can add something at the start. And we used to do that back then. Although I don't know if I'd do it now, but we used to say, draft paper, please do not quote or cite without consultation with the author. So, which was curious because, I don't know whether anyone wants to just, whether you want to, as a PhD student, whether you want to stop someone from citing your paper or quoting it. So as long as you're giving authorship. So if I was to do that again, I would probably take off that disclaimer. Go ahead, feel free to cite and quote me if you wish. But equally, I've actually, at that time, I then called somebody up on the phone whose paper from several years ago that they'd completely forgotten about. It was a working paper and I wanted to quote it. So I called them in their office in Scotland and I said, well, actually, there was some university, Stirling or somewhere, Strathclyde. And I said, well, actually, this paper of yours is really interesting, but it says don't quote. And they'd completely forgotten about it. And they said, yeah, please go ahead and quote. It's fine. So ideas have a way of living on. I don't think that, and also I think that it's really important to know that no two people, even two people talking about the exact same thing, will say the exact same thing. So even if there is somebody else working on the gig economy in some other, on say that same company workers in some other state or city, I don't think their argument will be exactly the same as your argument. And especially if you put a disclaimer or put your authorship clearly and have it out there, maybe it's so my kind of immediate response would be maybe it won't hurt to share your work, as long as you it's actually a way of you're laying dibs on it as well. If you're putting it out there, you're saying, okay, this is I'm working on this. You could frame it as this is part of my ongoing work on, so that people know that this is an area that you are not only just writing one paper in, but that you have a long or medium term interest in this area, and that might enable you to find networks and linkages as well So that would be like my instinctive response to that, the dilemma regarding sharing. Now the thing about so the other thing I would say is patience. As somebody who for years felt like the opportunity cost of my academic work was too high, because it was every moment that I did here was a moment that I could not write fiction, or creatively tell the really important, equally important actually, stories that I want to tell. But I think over the years, the line from, and I think it's Zora Neale Hurston, the American author, that there are ears that ask the questions and ears that answer. So there are, one has to be patient, and that's something that's very hard to learn. I think it only comes with age, that you recognize that there are, things take time. It happens. There are rites of passage. We have to, the PhD is an important rite of passage. You get through that, then, and so are the early career years. In some senses, I must own up, I'm not a straightforward, if you want to be a straightforward academic who is only focused on a narrow area, you wouldn't be doing so much multidisciplinary work. You certainly won't be, unlike what I've done, you certainly won't be switching disciplines. You would not have, dark nights of the soul wandering in that search for knowledge. So it's everyone's journey is their own. It's really hard to say this is the right way of doing it. I gave up a tenured post in economics. It's not the easiest thing to do, to give that up, to give a kind of permanent full-time post up. But I felt like for reasons that were really significant to me in the aftermath of the Iraq War, I wanted to be not a part of the problem that perpetuated a certain ideological knowledge framework within which pedagogically in the education system, it was very difficult to introduce new and interesting ideas. And I didn't want to constantly be a part of a system that kept on entrenching a certain conservative ideology that made the world a worse place. Even when I knew from my own research and from the research of several of my colleagues that at higher levels, at different levels of the discipline, we all knew to be the things that we taught the undergrads to actually not be true. I mean, from ISLM to demand supply. So that was a choice. It was a choice that came with its associated costs. But I think that those are personal decisions that everyone has to make. What balance do they want between career progress and a strategic kind of strategically building on that versus, kind of other kinds of values and satisfactions that give them more meaning. And I'd say just the PhD and the early career stage is possibly just the hardest, because you're kind of finding your feet and you feel like you've come so far, but it doesn't get hard. It doesn't have to get harder, and it probably wouldn't if you are patient and make those start belonging to those networks. So I would say in terms of conferences and networks and so on, that would actually also help you with finding co-authors, with and online modes make that more possible now. So there's no answer that works for everyone on how to do this in the best possible way. I think that's like life. We have to that part of it, that negotiation of it, like, to what extent, that's something that we have to do, whether we want to work on, as I was saying to Shumita, that those dilemmas, how we answer them, about should we do the fashionable thing, should we do the thing that gives us more meaning, should we work on a book, or should we work on that quick article, should we work on an article that's in a high impact journal and take a long time over it, or should we just get the article out to a readership that actually would appreciate that article and maybe isn't ranked as highly but is actually more critical. There isn't a good answer, but I think those choices are actually our own. And the important thing is, as long as we make them knowing, we should just pause and reflect. It's not wrong to do any of those things, either of those things in all of those situations. But I think we should just pause and think, okay, just give ourselves that mind space and think, okay, but should I do this? Will I be happy with it? Do I think right now, as of right now, will I be happy with this in 2 years and in 5 years? That's the best you can do. Maybe, moving along the way, you realize, actually, I should have chosen that other path. And I regret that, but that's just in the nature of, how we think about things, how we make meaning. There's just no perfect combination of the long and short run problems here.
Yeah, I get your point. Thank you, Professor, for delving much deeper into what I asked for, and thank you for your encouraging words for my thesis.
Good luck for your for publishing your work. for for this work. It really is I think a really important, this their own experiences I think are really important. That more kind of systematic understandings of developing, like what happens, what, and even that within, they're not just all gig economy workers. They're also people who may have specific identities. So, for instance, do minority religious gig economy workers of minority religions, do they actually get turned away? Do they face, in addition to, so my point here is one about intersectionality. In addition to the normal sorts of things, are there additional inbuilt levels of identitarian discrimination that they have to face intersectionally? Why are there so few women in that role? What does it mean for that role to be so specifically gendered? So there's a whole lot of questions. The world exists to constantly supply us with problems. So you will never run out of things. No one will ever run out of things to say things on. It's just in the nature of it was here way before we were, and it will continue. All the problems will continue to be here in one way or another. But hopefully we can just do what we can as best as we can.
Yeah, thank you for putting it loud, because I also faced this issue that I wanted to select as my sample an equal a number of males and females, but it was so difficult because the males are in majority and females are in minority in this arena. And then on top of that, they must be bullied. So that screening, half of them, even if I got them, then they must be bullied. So my sample got really skewed in favor of males as compared to females. So thank you. Like, I mean, it's a genuine, an issue which should be considered, and I would like to consider it in future as future projects.
And just to add, not specifically only referring to the gig economy, but to move kind of domains right now to something like international relations. So if we think about the fact that most understanding of power and of what power is seen as being and how it is exercised and whose rationalities matter are drawn from the experiences of big or medium powers or large states. The experiences of small states are seen as being irrelevant and not important. I'll come back that there is a link to what we were talking about. So the experiences of small states, even though they are all kind of they are sort of seen as being outside the system and not relevant, because they don't have the big armies, they don't have the big kind of arsenals and things, and they don't have the big economies even. So that's seen as making them irrelevant, even though the vast majority of states in the world, increasingly so, are smaller states, and especially so after the breakdown of the erstwhile Soviet Union. So these various small states have their particular challenges, and I'm referring to some work that I published last year on this, on particularly on Bhutan as a small state, but also on the nature of small states in international relations. And so these smaller states are seen as an irrelevant anomaly, while these small states can actually offer us clues to looking at power differently, to looking at the way maybe they can't do that, but actually coordination and policy making is more easier. Their experience in multilateral organizations, they're small, but they have a representative voice, because there it's one nation, one vote. So there's also all kinds of countervailing factors as well that are at work in looking at small states that give us new insights. So looking at things that are outside the system, looking at the system also could mean looking at what has to stay outside the system for the system to be the way it is. And now moving back to what we were talking about, so maybe although those women are not gig economy, women are not economy, workers in that economy, but maybe it's worth stepping back and going one step back and looking at, okay, if you are able to access that data, that in the applications, is the recruitment in the applications broadly representative, or do more women, or at least more women apply, but then they don't make it to that stage or don't survive through that process? So if there are applications, or if not, sorry.
Sorry. So I think you must know driving, and I don't know, maybe in a tier 2 city, many women might not be comfortable. I mean, it's just my speculation. I didn't explore it intentionally, but otherwise there are no specific constraints in taking up this job. Anybody can take this, but driving is a mandatory thing. You must know driving to take up this job, and you must have a identity proof. That's it.
And now I see actually, so even in a city like Delhi, now I see, I think partly because of the traffic, a lot of these workers, and especially at sub-regional levels, are using bicycles. And it presumably it's less hard and less intensive for women to be able to access bicycles than it may be to access other kinds of transport. So these there are these changes, but my point there was then maybe it's worth looking at so outside the system kind of a thing. So even with e-rickshaw drivers, right, or most of the e-rickshaw drivers and cycle rickshaw drivers as well, where they exist, tend to be men. But you would even in suburbs of Delhi find the occasional woman doing that job. Now that, so if somebody was looking at a representative sample, there's, she would of course be a complete outlier in that job. But my point there with the small states example was maybe specifically and very intensively focusing also a separate smaller work on the experience of that which is outside or that which is an outlier or an exception also helps to understand the system as it is. So one way of understanding the e-rickshaw community would be to go and interview the e-rickshaw people and kind of work with those who are in part of that in the overall context. And one way would be to actually only focus on somebody who has a different identity within a system that makes them exceptional or an outlier, and look at the system from the perspective of the, what does looking at this experience tell us about how the system works. So likewise, if you could find even like in a larger sample, you don't have the number of people to make it representative, of course. But if you find even one person, then aside from this particular work, you could have a different work, a smaller piece of work, perhaps maybe just an article, where you focus on not a whole dissertation, but where you focus on the experience of that one person or those two people only, to look at that, the rest of it from the experience of those people or that person individually, even to see basically what I'm saying, that the system viewed from outside or viewed from the most extreme end of it, the outlier within the system.
After listening to you, I was just connecting dots that the two females that I interviewed, they did mention about safety issues because they have to deliver at night and it's really risky, and chances are like goons and all these problems arise where they snatch food from you and they don't even pay. And then there are no toilets. Public accessibility to toilets is so rare. And then they were complaining like even parking issues. They are asked to. There are no certain parking places reserved for these food delivery workers, so they end up getting bullied by security guards also. So yeah, but there is obviously I think much more to explore. But yeah, thank you for giving fodder food for thought in this regard. Thank you.
I just want to add one more thing here, because I also resonate with this issue where on the one hand there are different categories and we want to talk to people across categories, but we also sometimes we are not able to for different reasons. But one thing that I would add here is that which I am also trying to do in my writings is, even if we have like just say one participant from the other category, whatever is the quote unquote other category that we see, and whichever way it makes sense to us. One thing to do is that we also look at what does this experience, does it help us interpret the others differently, which we have already done. So if I have 30 men and one woman, does this one woman's experience or her articulation of her work, does it change my interpretation of all the other 29 interviews that I had done? And that probably tells us something about the gendered context for the other gender as well. So for example, even my own bias when I was doing research and I would ask, does gender make a difference? I would ask these questions to women participants and not to male participants. Then itself reflected how I was sort of doing the research. And also, even if I didn't ask the gender question would inevitably come in a woman's interview, not in a whatever quote unquote men or males interview. So what does that tell me about about the work or about their experiences? What becomes something to be articulated and something not at all a concern in my life? So even if we don't have a sample, it still tells us something about, let's say, gendered nature of the work. So that's.
Yeah, exactly. And sorry, no, go ahead, please.
No, sorry. I also had this just to add to what Muneeb said. So when we talk about gender, we often talk of it in terms of binaries, but very often we might not know that the person whom we are talking to, because we probably already boxed them into these two categories, might not actually be part of those. So sometimes certain bodies, because of how they perform themselves, might actually not subscribe to the category we might put them into.
Yeah.
So there is much more gray areas than the two binaries that we assume to be.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and can I just say something, Muneeb? I just have a few. Yeah. So the thing between, so exactly. So you see, I see gender actually. In my recent work on misogyny of authoritarians in contemporary democracies, I've argued that gender is actually a relationship of power. So that which is feminized, whether it's so in, for instance, if you think about how in an authoritarian context, that which is feminized isn't always women. It can be all kinds of marginalized identities that are seen as less than the norm and therefore often spoken of in derogatory terms that are feminized, and in order to portray them as, weak because that of association. And that includes, sexual minorities, that includes those who are seen as, speaking for human rights, those who are seen as speaking for environment, and so on. Which is, so there's nothing, they don't even have to be embodied women. Of course, the embodiment adds that dimension, and that's far more common way of seeing it. But it doesn't have to be. It's that move, the move of feminizing and othering, which, say, for example, if we look at it in the context of global politics, the historical experience of, countries of the global south that have been often infantilized and referred to as kind of, immature global citizens, or we think about the way in which the non-West has been exoticized and feminized, sites work on Orientalism. So this othering, the broader process of which it is a part, is that othering process. In order to preserve, to quote, to quote from my book again, this idea of the structurality of the structure. In order to preserve that, there's some things that need to be kept on the outside, that are placed on the outside, and that process of othering is consonant very often with that process of feminization, so that so it's strong to do a certain thing and it's weak to do a certain thing. So that if I put the terms nature, science, nature, sorry, reason, nature, man, woman, whatever, all of these terms will align one on this side of the binary, black, white, the other on the other side. Why is that the case? It seems to be it is a universal thing. Anywhere that anyone that you speak to and you ask them, okay, rank these two words, which side would you put man and woman, and which side would you then put reason and nature, reason and rationality and emotion? And most people, most places, with very little exception, would put that in a system. So there is an intrinsically kind of naturalized understanding through which that which is to be othered is also feminized. And so that has to do with all kinds of marginalized identities, including politically marginalized, socially marginalized, economically, and so on. So there's that part that I wanted to say, that and getting the neat one versus the other, A B continuum as opposites, the neat thing is always sort of it's not how things actually are, because, as I said, gender is a relationship of power, and with degrees rather than simply two absolutes. The thing about also that I want to say, so yeah, exactly, like one of I think you were saying, working mothers, nobody ever refers to, as Zerubbabel says in that book, nobody ever refers to a working father. Nobody says, oh, he's a working father, because it's assumed that fathers work and mothers sometimes may not work, and therefore it's a working mother. So even our linguistic categories and terms reflect that in all sorts of situations. So the marking, therefore, the marked and the unmarked identities within that context, the marking doesn't, gender is a part of that, but there are all other kinds of markings, and they may not always be visible. So you have to also remember that there is no no clearly diagnostic way in which you as a researcher can go and talk to a subject and uncover the complete truth. There will always be, there will always be various kinds of power differentials. First of all, the fact that you are the person who's asking the question and the other person is answering them. itself, that there's a hierarchy, no, and you can try your level best not to have that be obstructive, but it is nonetheless, there as part of that very setup. And within that context, the thing that you need to do is to be aware of it, is to acknowledge it, including in your written work, to say that yes, there was this, that there are these ways in which I tried to mitigate for that, account for that, but fundamentally there are ways in which the knower known relationship, the fact that you're asking the questions, creates a certain relationship there which has its own power. And this is why, by the way, the ethical reflection is really important, because it creates that power difference. And not all marginalizations are always are even always apparent. People might not, it's not like you go there and you have a textual photograph exactly of what this person's life is. They may just be telling you what they think, as you know from your various methodological reflections, that they may just be telling you what they think you might want to hear, or what they might want to be heard, whether that is what they feel or not. They may be telling you things that they may be ashamed of telling you. There may not have been a context of telling you that. I mean, the paradigmatic example of this for me is the relationship, is the interaction with a medical professional. So if you're, if I go and see a doctor, and the doctor is super busy, and I'm talking to him about the fact that, I underwent this gallbladder operation and I'm having this trouble and that trouble, and they say, okay, blah, blah, blah. And then they haven't asked me other questions. They're busy, there are students present, etc. And I feel, how do I tell them that I've gone through hell, recently? There's just been like 100 other things that have been going on. My mother underwent surgery. It's like, life has been traumatic. So I don't tell them that. They infer, so they infer based on what they see, just as you will infer based on what you come across. And therefore we have to be careful also to not infer too much from too little, or generalize too much, or there has to be also, like in our judgments, a confidence interval thing. Like, am I saying this with high confidence, with low confidence, or with medium confidence, and why so? So, and putting that on the table, including in your writing, to say, actually, this is a finding that I'm very confident about, because all of the possible objections, I would counter them in this way. This is a finding that I think is relevant, but I actually have a lower level of confidence in it, because I think there are all of these other factors that could have played a role in how I got here. And I don't have, the world being what it is, I don't have a pure way of fixing this. But as it is, that ambiguity and the dilemma is also part of what I'm presenting you in my, in my work. And so I think that part is important. Not all things are visible. We might know that this person is, and people might sometimes pass off different identities. You can see me as a woman. You can see me as somebody who's based in the global north, and is brown skinned, but you can't see the fact that I have a metal plate in my arm. You can't see the fact that I have, I may have other experience of disabilities that I'm functioning with. So we are never ever actually, it's very tempting in this kind of work to think we know. But we don't know. We know only within certain parameters, and we have to be explicit about those parameters. I would argue that makes, actually, even if that. So this very excellent kind of a feminist professor, she was, she asked this person a question in one of their presentations, a man a question in an ISA presentation a few years ago, and he hadn't looked at gender at all, and he simply hadn't, either one way or the other. And she said, even if you haven't, what you could do is acknowledge and say you haven't. Even that is at the very minimum, it is important to acknowledge that which you have not thought of as being worth attention. Because that, at the very least, I think a reader or an audience can demand of you. You even if your analysis hasn't, you have to acknowledge that you haven't. Because otherwise you're not stating, it's going back to that whole question of passing off as universal something which is very particular. If you're talking about the experience of a group of men who are part of this system or setup, then actually the title should say of male, male politicians in this or whatever, or male whatever category. So that I think is also a kind of more more about ensuring that your work is, has a veracity. It's not claiming to be what it is not.
I think Andy has written a question. Nitasha, could you please mention this work of yours. Which work, Andy, if you can?
Natasha was mentioning this book or an article. I'm not sure what
Okay.
was the work exactly.
Which
Okay.
one?
Just now, in response to Garima, you mentioned a work of yours of feminization.
Othering and
Oh, I
structure,
think
related to
Did I say
log.
structure.
the one on misogyny of authoritarians?
No, I think the logic of othering, that the feminization logic works in all kinds or different kinds of binaries.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So that's part of what I've argued in that misogyny piece about how feminization works as an othering process.
Yeah.
And it others not so misogyny actually I'm arguing is a political strategy. It's not just an individual attribute. And that misogyny enables a certain kind of othering that then allows a kind of othering of people who speak about human rights, who speak about environment and a whole range of other domains. And this doesn't just work in any one specific country. So in that paper, I argue that it actually works across global north and south
Hmm.
in countries where have different majority religions, different kinds of systems, so that it's actually not something that's limited to one part of the world. It's called Misogyny of Authoritarians in Contemporary Democracies, and it's in the International Studies Review. And it actually began from, as a lot of what I do begins from, just upset at how things were. It was just upset at the fact of Trump, at the fact that why were there so many people who were willing to sort of look away, especially in the initial years, and say, oh no, there must have, there was this other thing and this other thing. Do pretty much focus on every other thing except the fact that the gender question in there. And it took a while because I came back to it and went back to it at different days, but it was very satisfying to actually submit it to the journal. And in fact, the journal, so I have, so recently a younger scholar asked me, have you ever got a desk reject? Yes, of course I've got a desk reject once on I at least once on this paper that was based on Bhutan, and I sent it to a big IR journal in America, and of course they were probably like, where the hell even is it? So I got a desk reject. But with this paper, the ISR paper, I sent it off, and on the day that Trump lost on 6th November, and it was just a brilliant process. Like, I just loved that process, and I think that was because I was so driven by that work. Like, I really wanted to, and maybe that came through in how the reviewers also saw it, and then how I was able to then take on their insights on board as well. And so I think that the passion part is important. But of course, there is a different advantage if you work on the same area, and if you work on that consistently, only that. Maybe it's not always as challenging, but I think it's perhaps in reward terms, maybe it's a different process. As a maybe I don't know if it's as taxing as
Hmm.
having like 150 articles every time you begin work on something, because you're like, okay, now I need to understand everything about this. So it's hard, but everything has its advantages and disadvantages. And oh, and I think that there's this line that from an old movie called The Rules of the Game. It's a French movie, and I love this line from it because it says, the awful thing about life is this, that everyone has their reasons. And it is actually true. Like, the really, as we know, there isn't just a reason. There are competing rationalities at work, and our task is to be able to understand them without legitimizing them, without
Yeah.
just saying that, oh, therefore it's
Yeah.
rational from that point of view, therefore it's justified overall. That definitely isn't how it works. Another really, I think the thing that's useful for me is also to archive. So I try. I'm so glad you've recorded this, Muneeb. So please,
Yeah.
you also send me a copy, because I
Yeah.
think having everything in a place, especially with the ephemeral nature of the digital sphere, that it's something you might publish on in an online journal may not exist in 10 years time. So it's always good to save PDFs, to have your a kind of organized set of things that so that you can go back to think about, including in discussions that you record and can revisit.
Yeah.
So yeah, so for Andy, uh, Andy. So in terms of that, what I try and do is, like, on my own website under the CV page, I list everything and update it. So as it was last updated about a month ago, but I try and put everything there. So if when going back over the notes, and if you think like, what was that thing that she referred to there, then it's definitely going to be there on the CV page. I put a link to everything there.
And I also put the link for the paper in the chat.
Thank you.
Yes, and I think Daisy, you had raised your hand. I don't know if you still have the question, but we couldn't come
No,
to you, Vika.
no, it's fine. It's answered. I
Okay.
can't.
I have a question. Sorry.
Who's
Yeah,
that?
go ahead.
Uh, so, hi,
Is that
Professor.
correct?
This is Rima again. So,
Okay. Yeah.
you also mentioned about orienting your research. I mean, making your research more multidisciplinary. So, I just wanted to know the process of, because I think from what I could make out is that you made a conscious and deliberate choice to venture into multidisciplinary research. So because like when we do research, so my research is rooted on a certain theoretical framework that I began with, and like it's more rooted in positive psychology, concepts of hedonia and eudaimonia, and then obviously we'll build up from what the data says. But how did you chart into this journey of multidisciplinary research? Can you please throw light on this?
So I so it isn't it's really for me it's just always been organic. I did not actually think that I think it's if you want a one word answer, it's possibly just uh, you know uh, um, lack of being settled, unhappiness, I don't know, not refusing to kind of stop. I don't know, there isn't a good answer because it certainly doesn't make sense. I think maybe the idea is that life's too short, and I'm very conscious of the fact that as one life, I just want to know a lot more, and perhaps there the being able to okay, I don't know, I really don't have a good answer to this, but say for example, when I was a child, I wanted to be a horse rider and a train driver and a the prime minister and an astronaut, all of them. And
Hmm.
then obviously, which was never going to be possible, you couldn't, that's not how adult life works. So then I figured to myself, obviously I can't, I can't do these things, I can't even be each of these things for one day, like, hazaro khwahishe aisi har khwahish pe dam nikle, how do you do that? So then I thought, okay, but if I wrote, and this is why I think the power of stories is really powerful to me, like the idea of writing, whatever, in freer forms and in more institutionalized forms, that if I wrote, I could be those people in the writing. Like I could write from the point of view of somebody who's dealing with politics or with horses or with outer space. Obviously, as I grew up, I realized that those weren't the only domains I wanted to write about. In fact, I ended up writing political fiction much more, but also, equally other kinds of what if questions. So I think that comes from that part, the idea that there are so many things, and perhaps the way to do them would be writing. I think is a, as all civilizations since the very ancient times have known, writing, there's a magic about writing. That's why, Saraswati is a goddess. That's why Egyptians had thought the god of the word. So the word is actually a very powerful thing. It actually brings into being things in the world that we hadn't thought of in the same way. So writing is one way in which one can experience multiple domains. Now, if I think about the disciplinary aspect, then my life panned out nothing like I thought it would, because I would probably have done medicine and then done the civil services and then joined politics and then given excellent speeches and then become the prime minister. It used to always end up, by the way, at being the prime minister. So that's obviously not how it happened for a whole lot of reasons, some of which were very tragic. But my point is that the intellectual journey with economics. So, for instance, I'd studied sciences at school, and then I thought, okay, literature is something I can continue reading. But after studying sciences, as I said, there were certain very tragic reasons I couldn't, I didn't then want to go into medicine. So when I was studying economics, what really struck me was, and this dissonance, that many people in my classroom, and I went to SRCC, so you can imagine, like, a very kind of economics driven college, economics and more business driven college even, and there is a very important difference. And they wanted to just be rich, so they were studying economics because they wanted to be rich. And I felt like I wanted to know about how this economy thing works, because why are people poor? So it was basically, you can start within the same discipline by asking different questions. And that those questions, I think, then determined, and my master's was interdisciplinary in economics with public policy, because I thought that the interdisciplinarity was appealing to me. My master's dissertation included looking at what was then really interesting and growing at that time as a field, the intersection of economics and psychology. So, looking at experimental psychology specifically. So looking at challenging the rational economic man paradigm of utility maximization from the point of view of, what if people maximize risk aversion? What if people have loss ambiguity? How does it work in actual experimental situations? So by then, I think at that time, Kahneman, Tversky, etc., had not been given the economics Nobel. So experimental economics wasn't what it is now. And my dissertation was on self-serving biases, cognitive dissonance, and economic policymaking. And then my PhD was was on economics and philosophy, and culminated in imagining economics otherwise. So the first 10 years of my engagement with economics was really a journey of gradual disenchantment. And but that disenchantment wasn't unproductive at all, because I was learning everything that I wanted to make sense of in a different way. And I think that it is true, as people say, economics is politics by other means. So the rest of that journey, certainly the last 10 years or so, has been through explicitly approaching that politics as politics, rather than via, looking at, and the fiction's always been there. So it wasn't really a choice. So for instance, my work on Bhutan, which goes back to 2006 and, has been more or less intense at different times, actually grew from simply just traveling there in the region, not just there, and speaking to people, not as an academic, just speaking to people as a person who's curious about her surroundings, all of whom were really, really troubled by the fact that democracy was going to come to them. And thinking, that is really strange. Everybody loves democracy, especially when you contrast with what was happening in Nepal at the time. And that then led me to get interested in, okay, what is this transition to democracy that's happening there? Why is this so different? Why is this so something that people don't want? Because how could people actually prefer a monarchy over a democracy? Because although there had been political disturbances in the country, that was 20 years ago. At that time, there was nothing inevitable about the fact that the transition to democracy should have happened. So it began really as an intellectual puzzle, and I thought I was only going to be talking about the democratic transition. But as I began to know more and read more and got into the archives, then I got into the longer history of the country over time. And so it was an organic process. And therefore I believe in this idea that, for me, not true for everyone, everyone has their journey. But for me, what is important is to let oneself, beyond a certain understanding, let oneself be led by where a question takes you, and to do your best in trying to explore it in certain ways. So I would not say you have to necessarily be multidisciplinary, but if as an economist, for example, as an economist, drawing from my own experience, if you're working within the field and you constantly think, okay, well, beyond a point, okay, people do this because they have these preferences. But actually, if you really intellectually want to ask the question, but where do the preferences come from? As John Elster asked in a J.O.N. John, in an American Economic Review paper in the 1990s, that where do preferences come from? Then the discipline's only answer to you is going to be, sorry, too bad, we're not going to tell you that. You've got to go to psychology to understand that. Or if, as a psychologist, you're working on how preferences arise, but then there's something very specific about that troubles you, but why are these preferences attributed to this group of people? How do they arise within this context? And if the discipline's answers to you, which it likely would be, well, you have to be a sociologist for that. And you find, so if the questions lead you a certain way, and that is an individual journey, they may or may not, you might find other venues that are more productive for you. But if they lead you a certain way to cross the disciplinary divides, then I think that should not be less valid than a journey that is a single discipline. Although, of course, the advantage of one other way of doing multidisciplinary collaboration is simply to do that with people who already are in other disciplines. And if you have a level of collegiality and trust between the person you're collaborating with, then you could also work with somebody. It possibly saves you all of the hard labor yourself. You could also kind of collaborate with people across disciplines that may be thinking about the same thing, but from different angles. So, we're all in the same building. We're just looking at the same scene from different windows on different sides of the building, and we're saying, okay, that's what the scene looks like. This is what the scene looks like. but actually where you know the world is not, you know, people don't actually decide to function as subjects of sociology or subjects of economics or subjects of psychology. They're actually functioning in their life in all of those things together. So you know, so the division is an artificial one that we put on. I mean, it's perfectly valid, for instance, to provide explanations of the transition in India at the time of what was the liberalization, that focus only on the economic liberalization. And it's also perfectly valid for people to, from anthropology or history or politics backgrounds, talk about the Hindutva transformation that started to happen in India at that time, the rise of the BJP. Nothing wrong with that. But I actually, for me and for others, the curiosity is also like, but these transformations are happening at the same time. So what is the actual thing? So going back to the neoliberal nationalism thing. So what is because people aren't just becoming this or just doing that. They're also doing both of those things. We as scholars decide to partition and, you know, cut up a certain section of the world and focus on that. But actually that the world is much more complex. So it really is, I would say, Garima, thank you for asking me that question because it allows me to reflect. But I think that there's it's just a question of the breadth of lens, the feasibility at any particular point in time, that sometimes you want to also narrowly focus on something, and that, you know, that's equally important too. The broader, easier ways of doing that is to read the work of those who have worked with a history of ideas. So, you know, whether that's people who worked with history of ideas in the context of, say, colonialism, or people who worked with a history of ideas in terms of like what has happened intellectually, the shifts in ideas. But one thing is for sure, that before the 19th century, mid to late 19th century, the disciplinary divides were not what they were after. So that, you know, even the well-known, so if you think today, of course Newton is a scientist, but Newton wasn't just a scientist, he was also a theologian. He also wrote about rainbows and gods and lots of other things. So all of these people were lots of different things. They weren't just one thing in either in this or that part of the world. So I guess the kind of epistemological point here is that divide part structures thinking a certain way, allows us to ask certain questions at greater length, certain other questions maybe not so much, or maybe keeps them in perpetual deferral. And that, why and what purpose that is saved, is part of the, you know, the kind of history of ideas and sociology of scientific knowledge, that one could move beyond the different disciplines to get to that, but one also may just not. It's also useful to, you know, to pioneer work that is very, very located in a particular field and moves that forward. There's no value judgment, and there shouldn't be, about the only value judgment needs to be with work that is not reflective of itself, that where the researcher doesn't ask questions about ethics or about power, or reflects on those, the nature of those differences, and doesn't acknowledge identity. Those kinds of things I think are problematic, not the other stuff.
Thank you so much for such an elaborated answer.
Thank you very much.
Yes, anybody has any more questions quickly? I think we have already taken more of a time than we had asked for. And in the meantime, I have put the link for the video on blockchain. I think this is it. Line goes up in the chat. I also put the paper on misogyny, and I also put the link to Professor Kaul's website in there, so you can check it out there. Does anyone have any question or comment? Okay.
So I don't obviously, you know all of your names, but it's nice to see you, and thank you to those of you especially who've kept the video on, because if all of you kept your video up, then I wouldn't be able to see you. So Anupama, and also there was another person, she's not here right now, but yeah, thank you. And you've obviously put a lot of effort into organizing this, and I think it's really useful.
Yes, I just want to thank you on behalf of all of us. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and thank you for speaking, and thank you for taking us through your journey, both intellectual journey as well as personal journey, and personalizing the researcher, as we say, embodying yourself as a researcher, and opening up to us. It was really, it really helped me in understanding the journey of, the importance of looking at ourselves as researchers and our journeys, that we're also part of some historical context that is ongoing. Thank you for sharing with us. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you so much. I truly appreciate you doing this. And I think that, it's so much more possible to do this, as I said to you before, in a structured format. I have so much guilt when individually somebody writes to me with something that requires a very detailed response and it's simply not possible. And I just, we often, I think all academics, but we live with that guilt. Like, I wish I could, but it's not always possible. So this is really brilliant because it brings people together. And yeah, and I'm yeah, really grateful to you for organizing this and for you all to share your questions. And I wish you all the best with your work, with your publications, with your thought processes, and networkings and collaborations and everything else. All right.
Thank you so much.
It was a wonderful session,
Thank
Professor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
much.
you
Thank you.
so much.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. Tell. Bye. We'll talk. I'll drop any email regarding the recordings and all. Then we'll discuss. I think all of them are left now.
Right. So thank you, Muneeb, and thank you, Anukriti. I'll be in touch. But thanks a lot for this. Have a great weekend.